So the core of the teaching really is that life is a happening. That is really, when we boil it down to one thing, it's life is a happening. And what that means is that it's a happening according to God's will, not my will. And if you can find an attitude towards life at any moment that is that what happens is part of life, part of the story of life, it has happened, that is the happening, and that it is God's will and not my will. The reason that that's the core of the teaching is because the teaching is about something very specific. The teaching is about happiness for the human being in this life, continuous, unbroken happiness. And it's very important to describe that the happiness that these teachings are about is the true happiness for the human being, which is happiness in a very particular form. Happiness through peace of mind. So really the word happiness in the context of this teaching means peace of mind, being equanimous, being untouched at one's core by the happenings in life. So the happiness that is available for the human being, the enlightenment, the liberation, comes in the form of unbroken peace of mind. And unbroken peace of mind more specifically means the absence of suffering, the non-arising of suffering. And suffering isn't talking about unfortunate circumstance. It's not talking about the pain of illness, the pain of terroristic attacks, the pain of poverty, or the pain of the fact that disabled children are born into this world. It's talking about the suffering which arises in the form of an uncomfortableness with oneself, and that uncomfortableness is always included in one's attitude, how one sees the happenings in life, how one interprets the happenings in life, relative essentially to who I am, what it means to who I am. So what I've said so far is that the core of the teaching is that life is a happening. God's will from the beginning of time to the end of time. Everything, including our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, the actions of the other, the circumstance, whether the car breaks down, whether the plane takes off late, whether there is building noises or beautiful trees, all of that is the unfolding of the masterpiece creation of life. And none of it is my doing. It's all a happening. Why is that important? Because the talks are really about happiness for the human being, and happiness is available in the form of continuous unbroken peace of mind. And continuous unbroken peace of mind is what is there when suffering, which is attitudinal to circumstance, falls away. And our suffering, when we look at it, the uncomfortableness with oneself that disturbs the peace of mind, is based on seeing what happens as my doing and the doing of the other. So that's a basic attitude or basic component of the attitude that leads to suffering. And the second component of the attitude that leads to suffering is interpreting pleasure and pain, which is an inevitable part of the flow of life. In fact, that's all the flow of life is, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Flow of life means whatever the circumstance is. So the second part of the attitude is interpreting the pleasure and pain of life as being something that adds or takes away from who I am. The deeply ingrained belief that I will become complete when I achieve this or that, when the world becomes peaceful and there is love on earth. Our attitude is one day I will be okay when circumstance is perfected. Seeing life as a happening undermines that movement of the thinking mind that disturbs our peace of mind. It renders it invalid. Because if all of life is happening according to God's will, the idea that I am the doer and the other is the doer is not compatible with that. When the other delivers pain to us as part of the circumstance of life, it can be seen as a happening, part of the unfolding of the story, my destiny for pain to be delivered in that moment, and the destiny of the other to be the instrument through which life is functioning, to deliver that pain. This attitude means that the other is not seen as a separate, independent doer that is my enemy, that is my competitor or rival, but rather an instrument through which life is functioning, through which my destined pain was delivered. So the pain still needs to be endured. This change of attitude doesn't remove the pain. And pleasures in life that are delivered through our actions and through the actions of the others still will happen, and so we get to enjoy those pleasures. So this attitude doesn't push pleasures or pain away. It accepts that as part of the story of life, there will always be circumstance, and the circumstance is either going to be pleasurable or painful, depending on how the circumstance matches my biological preferences. If the circumstance is in line with my biological preferences, pleasure. And if the circumstance is not in line with my biological preferences, then pain. So the attitude won't get rid of the pleasure or the pain, but a change in our attitude from seeing the other as the doer and my completeness dependent on outcomes, that change in attitude will mean that the very heavy additional load of guilt and blame and pride, worry and expectation can fall away. And when that heavy load, which is additional to the pleasure and pain in the moment, falls away, we realize that was really what was making life uncomfortable and unbearable. Not the pain or pleasures of the circumstance. That's when, from our own experience, we can understand that what we're really looking for in life is this freedom from suffering, and not a life of pleasure, 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 which is what we're by default conditioned to move towards and to believe to believe is where our happiness will be found. Now, the seeing of life as a happening needs to be deep, needs to be total. Otherwise, it means that the system still includes the opposite belief system or the opposite attitude. And as the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, it starts to uproot the misunderstanding, the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. And when it's the understanding is total, then it means the misunderstanding has been totally uprooted, and even the understanding I am not the doer, that everything is that becomes irrelevant. We don't walk around living through a new belief system. That seeing undoes the existing false belief, and then we are left free of either idea. We then find ourselves just living life, doing whatever needs to be done in the circumstance, functioning according to our design, and understanding that whatever we do, whatever the other does, whatever the outcome is what was destined to happen, without the suffering arising, because the beliefs from where the suffering arises have been uprooted. Now, that understanding that gets deeper and deeper, and eventually, if it's destiny, becomes what we can call a total understanding. And remember, total understanding doesn't mean I now understand the workings of the universe and I have this great amount of knowledge. Total understanding just means the uprooting of the very simple but deeply ingrained belief I am the doer, I am a separate independent entity in control of everything that I think, that I feel, that I say, that I do, and therefore seeing the other in the same way, a separate independent entity in control of everything they think, feel, say and do. The total uprooting of that, and the total uprooting of the belief that, life really needs to turn out a certain way. Let me pray for life to turn out a certain way. Please God, let me find my soulmate. When I find my soulmate, everything will be okay. When I become financially independent, everything will be okay. When I get this promotion, everything will be okay. Just let my mother recover from this illness, because then everything will be okay. When that outlook towards outcomes is completely dissolved, where we know that my completeness is not dependent on those things eventuating one way or the other. So we're free from attachment to outcomes. We're free from the guilt and the blame and the pride that automatically arises when I see myself as the doer and the other as the doer. So that understanding becomes total, which means the total annihilation of what I've just described, when the concepts that I'm speaking about, which start off being understood intellectually, meaning they are delivered as a concept, and a concept basically means an idea, a notion, a description, a theory. And that's what these concepts are. They are describing life a particular way. And the teaching points out that any concept that anyone has ever put forward, no matter how enlightened or wise, intelligent that person is, the concept is exactly that, a concept, and not the truth. The only truth in the manifestation, according to this framework, this set of descriptions, the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am, which exists prior to concept, which we can know, we can be, we can connect to that impersonal sense of I amness and be that without thinking that, without needing to think it into existence. So that concept about all the concepts being concepts, the concept that says whatever I say, whatever has ever been said by anyone in history or anyone in the future, whatever has been written down is always a concept and not the truth. It's really saying that it's describing life from a particular perspective, with a particular point in mind, and that from a different perspective, with a different point in mind, the concepts may not be applicable. So the concepts are there to point us, to point our intelligence, our intellect, and our awareness at our own life experience, because all of these concepts are talking about everyone's life experience. So we can investigate what is being pointed at through the concepts for ourselves. And that's hugely important in the process of the understanding going deeper and deeper and deeper. If it remains on the level of the intellect just believed, and we don't look, we don't see the actual dynamics. So the concepts say something in fairly simple terms, like the flow of life, circumstance, the flow of life is circumstance, is always either pleasure or pain. That's a simple concept. We need to look at the flow of life as it happens in each moment and realize that pleasure and pain arises as a very complex, intense physical pain. For example, if I stub my toe. And that's what pain is referring to. And it also arises in the very complex form of emotional pain when someone we love dies. That is pain. And when we have a beautiful, sweet, fresh strawberry, the flavor in our mouth is a form of physical pleasure. And when profound feelings of love arise, that is another form of pleasure in the flow of life. So if we remain with the concept, we end up with a very flat understanding, because the concept can't describe what you can see, which doesn't necessarily mean just with your eyes, it means with your whole awareness and intelligence and understanding of what is happening in the moment, in all of its detail, or not really all of its detail, but much more detail than the concept can describe. And then as we start to become more familiar with what the concepts are pointing at, we then see how they interconnect. Also, in a way that is available with much more depth than I can describe by putting the framework forward. So the first stage is for what I'm speaking about to be understood intellectually. Which means if I ask someone, do you understand what the concept that says the flow of life is always going to be either pleasure or pain? Do you understand that concept intellectually? And if someone has heard it and says, yes, I understand what it means. You're saying that whatever happens in life, in any circumstance, means it's going to fundamentally just be a form of pleasure or pain. I go, fantastic. It seems like you understand the concept intellectually. If the person looks at me blankly like I've spoken to them in a different language, it means that they haven't processed the concept intellectually, which is not really a concern to me. As I said, life is a happening, unfolding exactly as it's destined to happen, and the concepts will be understood or not understood according to everyone's destiny. If someone understands it intellectually, then the concept can start going deeper and deeper. The understanding of the concept goes deeper and deeper. If someone doesn't understand it intellectually, I can't imagine any thinking about it happening as one moves through their daily life and experiences daily life. Then the concept that isn't understood is not really going to be incorporated into one's observation or investigation of life. Whereas if it has been understood intellectually, and you go out to your car and you realize you have a flat tire, you might look at it and go, that's not in line with my biological preferences. And annoyance might arise. And then the thought, this is pain in the moment, part of my destiny, part of the unfolding of the story of life. Now, if that thought arises, that's not your doing, but rather the functioning of your current structure, who you are on a biological and a psychological level. So in this teaching, it describes the human being as the impersonal consciousness of Source linked to a particular body-mind organism, and then functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. So your experience of the flat tire is what you can call your personal consciousness experience of life in that moment. And when you look at it, every moment that you experience life is your personal experience of life, meaning the experience of life from the perspective of you as the main character. You're seeing life from the perspective of this particular body-mind organism through which the impersonal consciousness of Source is functioning as personal consciousness. Meaning it is the impersonal consciousness of Source that is aware of the flat tire in the moment, using this body-mind organism, every body-mind organism, as the vehicle through which it's functioning. So sometimes we wonder if God is out there looking at our life, seeing what thoughts we're having. Whereas if what I'm describing is understood, we realize God is aware of my life. My awareness of my life is God's awareness of my life. Right now, God is looking through and experiencing life as Roger and as Vikram. God isn't experiencing life simultaneous to me from somewhere else, but simultaneous to me because my experience is actually the experience of the impersonal consciousness of Source functioning through my body and similarly every other person's body. That's how close you are to God. So close that there aren't two. So we sometimes hear the saying that I think started off with Francis of Assisi, that which you are looking for is that which you are looking from. We are looking for union with God and waiting for it to happen. When will I bump into God? And it's pointing at the fact that you don't have to look very far. In fact, there's no distance. It's just that the looking outward needs to turn in on itself and realize that this consciousness that is flowing out of this body-mind organism is the very consciousness that this body-mind organism is seeking to unite with. It's why in Advaita we often hear you don't have to do anything, you don't have to achieve anything, you don't have to go anywhere. You're already enlightened. You are already it. Because we are waiting and thinking about going somewhere to find something out there. And as soon as that seeking stops, there's a realization, it was here all the time. So there is only an imagination that covers up the recognition of what we are at our core. And when that imagination falls away, then there is a looking inward. So your happiness is not to be found in outcomes, is a pointer saying essentially you are convinced your happiness is to be found in outcomes and you are looking out there for happiness through a soulmate, is one of the most deeply ingrained and common ways we're looking for happiness. And it's saying you're not going to find true happiness out there. You have to turn within, look within, and what it's pointing at is the consciousness, a recognition of the consciousness that is functioning through everyone in every moment. Consciousness doesn't come and go. You don't get more conscious. If you are aware of my hand, there is consciousness. Because without consciousness, there wouldn't be awareness of any of life. And so if we get lost in thinking and thinking about the past and the future, the consciousness is still 100% here. The consciousness is that which is functioning through the particular body-mind and aware of the thinking. It might not be actively aware of the thinking, but given that we can feel, we experience the effect of the thinking about the past and the future, means that there is consciousness registering the effect of the presence of the thinking about the past and the future. So we always have consciousness. It's often identified, forced to become identified with objects of desire, forced to become identified with thinking patterns that at their root are based on this attachment to pleasure, this belief that outcomes are to be found, or outcomes will deliver our happiness, and the belief that I have to make my happiness happen on my agenda. I have to work very hard and it will come in the future. And in any moment, if our system becomes equipped sufficiently, it can cut off that thinking. Just with a thought that like the thought I am. It can be consciousness, can be the thought. It could be stop. Whatever thought comes up for you as a reminder that arises spontaneously when awareness in your intellect realizes that the thinking mind is functioning in its different forms of suffering. And the different forms of suffering are guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And those forms of suffering are like an obsessive narrative that we think is actually beneficial. In its intense form, that narrative takes on a feeling. We can say that those forms of suffering, as a general description, are always an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, and ultimately both an uncomfortableness with oneself or the other is an uncomfortableness with oneself. So all of suffering can be classified by the description: suffering is an inherent uncomfortableness with oneself. And it's based on a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation, an error about who one is, who we are, and how life functions, what life is. And the error is my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and what I am is this physical body that is separate and independent, completely uninfluenced by anything else in life. I am the doer of everything that happens through me. So that is a self-identity that is quite inaccurate. It's a wrong version about what the human being is, a wrong version of what the human being essentially needs. It's a missing that the core of the human being is consciousness that has a sense of being at its core, and a sense of being at peace, being adequate and complete. That the core of the human being has none of the suffering thoughts. It's not capable of thinking suffering thoughts. The essence of the human being just happens to be something quite unique and precious, it turns out. The core of the human being is peace, is at peace with what is happening, even at peace with the imminent death of the human being. Not disturbed by the news that life is probably limited to the next 6 months. Should that news come for someone. The core of the human being is unaffected by that because it exists on a different dimension. It is content with its own beingness, its own I amness in this moment. I am. It doesn't require it to have been in the past or to be in the future. It is grounded in presence, and in that presence, the fact it is, I am, is its peace. The psychological entity that is a specific aspect of the human being is not at all at peace with itself, not at all at peace with what's happened in the past, which it is hanging on to, whereas the core of the human being is not at all interested in what happened then. To it is a long time ago. It moved on. What happened 2 minutes ago happened such a long time ago. Let's not dwell on it. It doesn't think that. It doesn't have the capacity to think. It just is being. The psychological identity, which is really a movement away, a disconnection from the core of the human being, is completely freaked out by everything in life. By the past, by how the future will turn out, by what's happening in the moment. There are complaints in the moment, regrets in the past, expectations in the future. And the thing that it is least comfortable with is the notion that it might not exist in the future. So a dissolving of the ingrained misunderstanding of who we are means a connection to what we can call our source. A recognition that whenever thinking, speaking, seeing, whenever daily life is present, then source is functioning through me. And that recognition, which is what has to be there when the I am doing it falls away, then the recognition that in every moment source is functioning through me means I'm always connected to source. Connected to source means grounded in your own being. So a movement from head to heart, a movement from thinking to being, is essential if peace of mind is a priority. True peace of mind is unlikely to reveal itself, is unlikely to be one's way of being in life, if this movement into beingness doesn't start to happen. And so there are several ways that this can be cultivated, this movement into being. One of the core understandings that starts to cultivate this is an understanding that the obsessive thinking and living through life through the attitude of thinking, where life is essentially always simultaneously interpreted as it's happening through this lens of doership and attachment to outcome. And that creates the disturbance. So a recognition that that is our disconnection from being is essential, so that from time to time we find a motivation to drop out of thinking. And this place of being can only ever be found in the present moment, where in the present moment there is an appreciation of what's actually happening, not through the story of doership and attachment, but a dropping into the presence, which means becoming aware of the objects. That is one way that we can switch the function that's happening, switch the function from the thinking mind. And when I say we switch the function, I'm throwing new conditioning out in the satsang that can become part of your up-to-date conditioning. And that up-to-date conditioning can start working at any point in time, can function at any point in time. So this description about how a dropping into the heart can happen can become part of your up-to-date conditioning, and then the very movement I am describing can start to happen automatically, not because you control it, but because that's how you've become designed. So I'm suggesting that one of the ways of the dropping out of thinking into being happens is when there is an appreciation that that thinking is our disconnection from our heart, and that we can only drop into the dimension of presence, which is the dimension on which consciousness knows itself, by dropping into the present moment and dropping out of the story about the past and the future. And we can drop into the present moment by becoming aware of the movement of life in this moment. And if we become aware of the movement of life with a soft gaze, an open panorama, and allowing the center of consciousness to drift into the heart area. So those three things: soften your gaze, open the vista. So all of these things you don't really do, but in the moment they will happen automatically because the conditioning is being thrown out now, which might become, so you soften the gaze, you open the panorama to see a singular view of many things at once, and allow the center of consciousness to drift into the heart. And without judging, without needing it to change, allow everything to be as it is, which means you might observe a tree swaying in the wind. Your attention might land on a bird flying across the horizon. And the attention doesn't need to be single-pointed. In fact, it's best if it's not single-pointed. So attention can recognize the movement of the tree and at the same time see that there are people moving in the space. And that can become an appreciation of life as a singular experience happening in the present moment. And if attention is on the present moment with no emphasis on judging the present moment as good or bad, without changing anything of the present moment, just an innocent witnessing of the vast number of different components which can be seen as a whole. Just like you can look at a picture in an art gallery, and it might be a picture of many different trees, a forest, and from one perspective you can see many separate trees. So as you look, take a broader perspective, you see it's just a single painting. So the non-duality is the recognition of life in this moment as a singularity with no boundaries between all of the seemingly different objects. Maybe a recognition that all of the objects that make up and arise in the present moment exist within your field of awareness. They are not outside your field of awareness. If they were outside of your field of awareness, they wouldn't be part of the present moment. So it may also become evident that this singular experience is happening within and not outside the awareness that is aware of the present moment. What can aid a deepening of this realization is to notice that the body, which we are so convinced is the subject, it too is an object, like all the other objects, in the singular arising of the present moment. And that the words are objects, part of the vast present moment experience in which everything is arising. And they too are objects. And the objects, the word objects, the sound objects, like the sight objects and the smell objects and the touch objects, they are all part of this multi-sensory thought, emotional experience of life, all arising within a field of awareness in the present moment. So any thoughts of the past and future, if they arise, are also objects in the present moment. To the extent that we are silently witnessing the physical world, maybe bringing attention into the body at the same time as maintaining awareness of the outer world, so we start to experience this is both what I know as inside my body and outside the body are actually all contained within this field of awareness. That is part of the movement from head to heart. Part of a recognition of what the human being is at its core. In this case, the awareness aspect, the formless awareness in which everything arises. So anything that is in the present moment has to be within the field of awareness. Should one of the objects of experience be removed outside of our field of awareness, it no longer makes up part of the present moment. If a dog is barking in what seems to be the distance, the bark is registered because actually the bark is within the field of consciousness, the field of awareness, not outside of it. Should it be outside the field of awareness, the bark would not be part of the experience. Now, labeling sounds as barking coming from a dog out there can not be so appropriate when we're just allowing the whole experience to arise as a singular arising in the present moment. So just being aware of sound as a component of the experience. And this movement, this stopping and being, in this case, being the awareness in which everything arises. This movement I speak of can happen many times in a day. It doesn't require you to be sitting in a special place. You can be at the bus stop, in the car, in the supermarket, walking on the street, walking in a park, and become aware of the present moment, which is all your life has ever been. Your life is always the present moment unfolding. So when your life was the 5-year-old at their birthday party blowing out their cake, that was the present moment. We only ever experience life as a present moment experience. This really is all there is, this moment. This is my life. So this shift needs to start happening. That means if it's our destiny for this shift to start happening, then it is a sign that a movement out of thinking into being is happening. And any time that there is a recognition that the thinking mind of guilt and blame and pride, expectation, worry and anxiety is taken over, that we have been dragged out of a connection to ourselves into the idea of myself, the idea that I am the doer, that I need to make things happen, that I didn't do it good enough in the past, that my sister or my cousin or my father didn't do it good enough in the past, that I need to have these things happen in the future. The complaining about the present moment. If we find ourselves having been dragged out, which we will be, because the fact is that so far life has ingrained the deeply ingrained belief that we are the doer, and so we have been living our life maybe never having had an experience of dropping out of that thinking, and therefore we are going to be dragged back into it regularly. It is essentially what we know as where to live life from. But that can change. That has to change. We will never find peace living life in that realm of thinking, because that realm of thinking is the thinking about the past and the future and the present through the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, and that is the thinking mind. That is the psychological reaction to life, that is suffering. That is the not knowing what I really am and what life really is. So if there is any hope for real, genuine peace with life, whatever the circumstance is, to set in, this movement from head to heart has to start happening. And if we find a motivation to drop out of the thinking when we find ourselves lost in that thinking, a thought says, stop, which really means stop this thinking and drop into being. Come back to seeing the amazing movement of all the cars weaving in and out of between each other, and the people crossing the road, and the birds and the dogs, and the trees. And there's a quietness in witnessing life without any intention to change it, without any movement of judging it. So you could drop into this 6 times a day for a second each time at first, maybe half a second. Someone might say, well, if I'm going to drop in there, why don't I hang out there for, a few minutes at least? Sure. The fact is, we're not in control of how long we hang out there. We're not even in control of when it happens during the day. And the likelihood is that at first there will be a remembering or a seeing that I'm lost in the thinking mind, maybe a dropping, and then without us even knowing, getting dragged back into the thinking. And after 15 minutes or 20 minutes of having got dragged back into the thinking without even realizing it, because in a way that's where we're comfortable, which is not really true. That's actually where we're uncomfortable, but it's the place that we have learnt to live life from. So after 15 or 20 minutes of having been dragged back up there, we might realize, oh, what happened to my interest in the present moment? I can't even remember being there and being dragged out. And so that is another opportunity to just say, stop and drop back into being. Now, this first exercise that I've been speaking about is not so much what we would say dropping into being, but more witnessing. Not the human being or the body witnessing. This is a more passive witnessing where there is no witnesser. Just witnessing happening, and we might understand that if we get a sense that the whole present moment experience, maybe drop the idea that this experience is as objectively real as we have always related to life. Drop the idea that time and space and objects are actually as objectively real as they feel, and start to see it as a very complex experience, almost like a night dream is a very complex experience in our consciousness. It feels very real. When we look at the dream, the night dream from outside, we realize it's just an appearance, an imagination in consciousness. And when we drop into being or into witnessing, witness this as maybe much more ephemeral than the objective world that we're so familiar with. We might start to recognize that the space may not be space, but a continuation of the single experience that's arising in the present moment. And as there's an exploration around being present with life as an experience, there might be a sense that what I am, at least in this moment, what I am is the awareness, aware of the present moment. Now, I've said this is an exercise, so it doesn't mean that you are absolutely the awareness that has nothing to do with the human being. But for as long as we remain rigid in our idea of being the human being we've always known ourselves to be, living in a three-dimensional objective world, then this dropping into the heart and connecting to the essence of the human being may not get developed. So I am suggesting to include this as an exploration, as a exercise, you could say, and within the exercise, don't take in your assumptions. It is an exercise of leaving your assumptions outside the exercise and exploring what the exercise reveals, using some of these pointers as things to take into the exercise as guides. The pointer that says the body is, from this perspective, an object like all other objects that is arising as part of the singular experience contained within the formless awareness that is aware of it, and that it is not the body aware of the present moment, but the impersonal consciousness of Source aware of the present moment, and that the present moment is arising and not separate from this impersonal consciousness of Source, that the present moment is all pervaded by the impersonal consciousness of Source. And this exercise is strengthening our groundedness in that aspect of consciousness that has been completely overlooked. from this perspective of the silent witnessing, not done by a witnesser, but rather where the witnesser collapses into the witnessing, meaning there is no separate subject observing the separate objects, but rather the whole singular momentary experience arising within that which is aware of it. In that witnessing, as the movements of life happen, it becomes much more experientially clear that life is a masterpiece unfolding, that life is happening and I'm not doing it. That all of the objects in this experience are moving, that the experience is a moving experience. Like a dream at night is a moving experience. And we might actually see that what we so often insist is who I am, the body, is also an object moving like the other objects in the experience. And if there is a groundedness in the perspective of formless awareness, it becomes clear that what I am is that which is witnessing, and the movement is happening, and I as the witnessing is not doing all of the moving. And the thinking can be observed as a happening, as part of this moving feast of experience. Any feelings can be witnessed as feelings arising in the experience. Feelings arising in a body-mind organism, but from a broader perspective, feelings arising in the formless awareness. So if this is foreign to you, and feels unnecessary, then consider that what I suggested is that if the true peace of mind that comes from knowing the core of the human being is to be something that starts to pervade our life, what I'm speaking about here is an important shift, an important movement. Also remember that I am pointing this out as an exercise, not as a realization of some absolute truth. So what can become apparent within a certain way of looking at life, for example, what I am in that moment, will not feel, if certain changes happen, like the body. But rather what I am is the formless awareness that is not separate from the experience, that nothing of the experience can arise independent of the formless awareness. And there can be a resting in a knowing oneself as formless awareness. That is what the experience is feeding back as what I am. Now that might not be as absolutely true as what is, as how it feels in the experience. There may well need to be an integration of that realization, but that integration into a more healthy understanding of oneself can't happen before the realization of that aspect of oneself. So you can't integrate the realization into a healthier perspective without the realization. And when I refer to realization, it's not a be end and all be all and end all realization. It's just a recognition. The body is an object inside what I am, rather than me being the body inside an objective world. It's a shift from seeing oneself as a physical entity inside a physical world to knowing oneself as a formless presence in which the whole world arises. That is seeing oneself from a different perspective. That is knowing a new perspective or a new aspect of the human being. The longer that we find ourselves being in this perspective of life, essentially we can call this meditation, allowing everything to be as it is, an open eye, or the manifestation, a meditation where the manifestation of daily life is present. The longer that this perspective of life arises in the course of a week or a month or a year, the more familiar we're becoming with a witnessing perspective to life instead of an involved perspective with what's happening. The involved perspective is where there is a judging everything as appropriate or inappropriate. That's okay, but that's not okay. I should do this, but I didn't do this. You should do this, but you didn't do that. I hate you for what you did. Can you hear all the noise? Can you hear all the involvement, as opposed to the silence of dropping back and watching life as a happening, where the motivation, the mission is not to change anything, not to make life perfect, but rather to see the perfection of the complex experience of this present moment.
So, just with the same subject, it's just that there is such a strong pull because there's so much clutter with the past and the future and the feelings and the sensations, and they have such a strong charge.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very easy to just keep falling back. I mean, and of course one touches that sometimes and it's so fleeting, but I mean, I'm not justifying that it's so, this is the reason why we are where we are, but it's like a gravitational sort of a pull to, because the body experiences all those sensations and somehow we are part of that body. For example, I could describe what you said, suffering as a contraction in the body.
Mm-hmm.
And the pleasure as an expansion, like a muscle, actual muscle, like it could be a solar plexus contraction when I don't feel good.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like physically happening.
Mm-hmm.
And it's happening in this body which has nerve endings and feelings. It's very difficult to cut it. Of course, I mean, I'm sure it happens sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, because this constant different teachers talk about, kinesiology talks about negative charge in the muscle, and a positive, when some positive happens, then you expand. So different teachers talk about it differently, but it's more or less the same, that we want to stay away from something that's uncomfortable. We don't want to experience the uncomfortable. So even if there is that experience of uncomfortable, I don't want to let it be there. I just don't want that contraction in the body. So how can I not feel the contraction? Or
so this isn't what I'm putting forward isn't a prescription of how to achieve something. It's not even a prescription of what you need to do 6 times a day. Because what you're saying is correct. If it's not your destiny for this to happen, then it is not your destiny. And so what I'm putting forward here is a set of descriptions within the broader perspective that life is a happening, not my doing, not your doing, and it will unfold exactly the way it unfolds, which is why I emphasize that what is said here might be heard by a doer, by the doer principle, as I have to do this, I have to make it happen, and I can't make it happen because there is a certain movement in my body and I just can't override that. And I'd say, relax, because I'm not telling anyone to do this. I'm putting the description out as part of destiny unfolding, allowing it to go out as new conditioning that may or may not become part of someone's up-to-date conditioning. And obviously it's only going to become part of someone's up-to-date conditioning who is exposed to it, either in the satsang or listening to it on YouTube or some other recording. And even if it becomes part of someone's up-to-date conditioning, the rest of their up-to-date conditioning might mean that it has no practical effect. It doesn't lead to a movement of stopping from time to time during the day. But for some people, the destiny is for these descriptions to be part of their life experience, for it to become part of their up-to-date conditioning, in such a way that it actually starts automatically functioning, which is not their doing, it just is their current genes and up-to-date conditioning, who they are in that moment, now functioning in a way that it stops from time to time. So someone else, let's say it's not you, right? Someone else is destined to hear this, it becomes part of their up-to-date conditioning in such a way that it doesn't lead to the witnessing of life as I'm describing. And I would accept that as the unfolding of destiny for the two different people and for myself. You know, it would be my destiny to have put out the description, and then my destiny to get feedback from one person that says, oh, this started to happen, and from the other person saying, nothing has happened. And I say, well, these are what's coming back is descriptions of each person's destiny, which is actually part of the one whole destiny, and how it has unfolded. So let's hope, why not, that from time to time, just once or twice in a week, there is a thought that arises, stop, and allow the present moment to be as it is, watching even the body as an object in the whole experience that arises in that which is aware of it. And if that happens 2 times in the week, for 2 seconds each, or 1 second, that's a huge improvement or huge change compared to it happening no times in a year, or no times in 35 years. Because it's the beginning of a movement from seeing life one way, finding oneself heavily involved in life, to just a moment which someone would say, well, if I spent 2 seconds there in a week, what's the difference between 2 seconds and no seconds? And if we look at it like that in terms of time spent without suffering, let's say, we'd say, well, 2 seconds without suffering is irrelevant. I would agree that having 2 seconds of living life differently is largely irrelevant compared to 0 seconds of it. It has no practical benefit. But if we see it as the beginning of a movement towards living life continuously from there, then we'd say, great, it happened twice this week, and let's see what happens tomorrow. Maybe it happens twice in one day tomorrow for 2 seconds. It's not a big task to have the thought arise. It's just stop and be. Stop and witness. And just it's about attention coming into the present moment. So let's see. Let's see what happens. It could be the beginning of a building of something very important. No need to be pessimistic. That's what Ramesh used to say.
Oh, well, I think it makes a big difference, even if it's only 1 second. It shows that it is possible.
Mm-hmm. I agree, yes.
That's the difference between 0 and 1. No?
I overlooked that very important point. You're correct, 100% correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. And in Course in Miracles, they say there is no difference between big and small miracles. A miracle is a miracle.
Mm.
And you are familiar with the Course in Miracles, as I noticed, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So 1 second only. Like this.
Yeah.
Okay.
The holy instant, I think it's referred to maybe.
Why would the source? Because we all do source.
Yeah, you did well, you did. But they can't. You did well yesterday.
Why would the source create this? Like you said, we're from the source, right? We are unmanifested, then manifested potential. And why do we have this whole conditioning and everything going on, only to realize that's all an illusion? So we've got layers and layers of conditioning and understanding and this and that and that and this. And all that is actually the last place we should have all been putting our energy into.
But that
That's
is
the source's plan.
Yeah, that's because that is the novel that the source has written. That is the film, or that is the experience, that is the dream that source has created, this particular one. Now that might be one DVD in a DVD library of experience that has unlimited number of different creations. We know this one. We are part of this particular creation. So one of the answers is, why not? Why not source create this particular drama? A story or a masterpiece, a creation of time and space, whereby source forgets itself, identifies itself as simply the physical, believes itself to be what it really isn't, suffers as a result, experiences. Yeah, this is its intelligence. This is like its creativity. It has used all of its creativity to create this very creative plot. And somewhere in the plot, it starts to reverse the forgetting and there are rememberings, first just moments, and then certain moments turn into lifetimes, and so then there are some people, and then more people remembering who they are, the suffering coming to an end, and Source remembering itself. So that, you could say, is what this creation is, and why not?
I mean, it is. Well, I just thought maybe you know better why the Source would be so intense.
I thought that was a good answer. It's creativity. It's intelligence.
Yeah, and I mean, according to you, it'd be like, okay, it is how it is. This is how it is. There is no other way.
Yeah.
So, what I define it as doesn't matter in that sense.
You have to turn the microphone that way.
Yeah, actually, I'm close to passive.
So the last exercise that I suggested is different to the framework that I put forward at the beginning of the talk. It's different to the conceptual framework that is a very, very important component of the teaching. This is another component that needs to be developed, this movement into being. And actually, so consciousness has two aspects to it, two primary facets to consciousness. The consciousness in the manifestation, the consciousness that we can become aware of as what is functioning through the human being, or what makes up the human being. So what is functioning through the body, but as a combination, the body and the consciousness is the human being. And the human being can awaken to the consciousness that is functioning through it. And that consciousness has two aspects. The awareness aspect, and when there is a resting in the awareness aspect, we can call that witnessing. And it is not someone witnessing as a witnesser, but just witnessing as a non-dual happening, where the present moment experience is recognized, what we call witnessed, and witnessed because there isn't a involvement in it. There isn't a movement to change it, to judge it. The other aspect of consciousness is the sense of existence, the sense of I amness, beingness. And in Ramana's reference to that aspect of consciousness, he would use the label I, as opposed to just single I. So when he was talking about the, I am this or I am that, which is how we tend to know ourselves or refer to ourselves when there is identification in the body, it is an I of thought, an I contained in thought about who I am and what I need, and I did a good job, I didn't do a good job, and then out of I there is you. And so that I is the I of the small self, the I of the psychological entity. And it has no connection to the true I, really. It isn't referring to I am this or I am that or I am the human, with a grounded connection into the beingness. Right? And so when Ramana was talking about your beingness or the self, the true self, the self that exists prior to the psychological idea of yourself, he would refer to I. And in Tamil, I has a specific notation. So his teachings were delivered in Tamil, and then the I is a translation. And so I is referring to a sense of I that is much less personal, doesn't have the characteristics of age and gender and preferences, and it isn't a thought, it is a feeling, an inherent feeling of being, an undeniable sense I exist, or just existence, but not a universal existence that isn't located anywhere, let's say, but more I that is experiencing. It is a feeling I, a sense I, not a thought. And because the word I causes problems in how people will hear and interpret what is spoken about, often, so in this beingness I'm speaking about, in Nisargadatta's teaching is referred to I am, the sense I am. And it's not talking about I, the person, am, when he's pointing at I am, but because the I part creates a problem sometimes, then it can be changed to I amness, which sort of suggests a verb, a movement, rather than a thinking. So I amness is like a sense, I amness. And there are times when it's referred to reduce the confusion further, not as I amness, but just amness, being or beingness, isness. So all of these words are referring to the second aspect of consciousness that I wasn't talking about so much in that exercise. So in that exercise, that is the awareness aspect of consciousness. And the awareness aspect of consciousness doesn't really have a sense of isness, beingness, amness. All of those are just different words for the same feeling of I exist. What is present in the awareness aspect of consciousness is simply the witnessing, the awareness of experience, the registering of experience. So awareness simply means seeing, when you see my hand, there is awareness of my hand. And so the awareness aspect is one aspect of consciousness, and the other aspect of consciousness is beingness, which has a different quality to it. It has more of a I am, I exist. There is existence in this present moment. It is undeniable. So if I asked you to close your eyes and you were able to drop into the space of a meditation space, and I ask you a question, and I say, are you dead? And I say, don't answer that from the intellect. Just if there is a presence with the present moment, and I ask you, are you dead? Then there is an intuitive sense based on the experience itself, based on your own, the feeling. No, I'm not dead. I am. I exist. Now that's a direct, that's trying to point to the fact that there is this aspect of consciousness that is always present in the self. And in Ramana's teaching, there is reference to a particular part of the awakening process. So the first part of the awakening process, or one part of the awakening process, could be to become aware of the awareness aspect of self, the witnessing. And then usually separate to that awakening, there is an awakening to the other aspect of consciousness. And these can happen the other way around. It doesn't, depends on the individual's journey. And the second aspect of consciousness is this I am, and in Tamil, the word, or Sanskrit, I'm not sure, Ramana referred to aham sfurana. Aham is I am, and sfurana is the bursting forth of I am. So in a particular moment, the I am that is at the core of everyone, but has gone unrecognized, just like this awareness that is at the core of the consciousness of everyone, that is always the background of our life experience, but has gone unnoticed for our whole lifetime. In a moment when that aspect of the self reveals itself by itself to the self, and awareness becomes aware of awareness, that is a moment you can call awakening, awakening to the self, or even self-realization. And the bursting forth of I am is when the sense of isness, that is also always the other aspect of consciousness, which does, it's really what informs us when we are a human being and we say, I am this and that. Really it's coming from the fact that there is a sense of I am functioning through the human being, but it hasn't been recognized. And so we only know the thought, I am. The feeling has sort of become irrelevant, but it's what inspires the thought. It's where the thought, I am this, I am that, actually originated from. If that sense of I amness that is at the core of the human being wasn't there, we would feel like zombies. A zombie doesn't have the sense of I am. It's why they walk around like there's no one there, just like a body doing its thing. And that's probably why zombies in the horror movies have a particular, there's a sort of fear that is engendered when we see it, because intuitively we see that they have no self, which we know we have, but we don't really know it. I mean, we experience it, but there's been no attention put onto it. And so when, in a particular moment, there is awareness of the self in either of its two facets, awareness, where there's witnessing, or the sense I am, that is part of the awakening to oneself. Now those realizations, even if we say it's self-realization, that is the beginning of a phase. It isn't the end. So to know yourself as the witness, to know yourself as I am, isn't liberation. Liberation is when that groundedness in oneself, in conjunction with the investigation of the ingrained beliefs, the two together uproot the deeply ingrained beliefs, and liberation is when we find ourselves living free of suffering. And the awakening to the core of oneself is an essential part of that. It can happen in much less extreme versions than many of the awakening stories that we hear, right? It can happen very subtly, where there one day is a shift that you don't even really register. There isn't a shift with big contrast. Maybe it even happens when you're asleep, and you find yourself witnessing life which you don't even necessarily register as having happened, until one day you notice that there is a distance that wasn't there before. A witnessing of thoughts happening, for example, that wasn't there. That is awakening. It doesn't require a full-blown awakening experience where you know yourself as nothing. That's how it can happen in some instances. And when that happens, it means a shift. Something has been broken, some of the existing wiring has been broken, and now it's different. And the practical effect is not to remain in this peak oneness experience, which often we think it's all about that. That is what we're looking for. But rather, it's about the shift being broken and then a much more simple witnessing, which really means a non-involvement happening. So doing the exercise can be part of the breaking, and it can lead to a sort of big realization, meaning a big experience of I am awareness and I amness as a separate awakening experience, or it can happen so gradually you don't feel any different. And it's only some point you realize, actually there is a change has happened. And then the process carries on, uprooting the deeply ingrained energies in the body of doership and attachment. And in that process, even after having recognized the self, there is still suffering and involvement that will keep happening. And one day, or in that process, gradual process, there is a fading away where the suffering gets less, the intensity can start getting less on average. You'll still have very intense bouts of it. The duration of it will start getting shorter and shorter as it gets cut off quicker and quicker. The suffering gets cut off quicker and quicker. There will still be anomalies in terms of duration that will happen. So you might find it gets cut off after 10 seconds most of the time, then one day you wake up and it's there all day. So it's not exactly linear, but it tends to be overall a reducing thing. And when the suffering no longer arises, then you can say that the awakening has turned into liberation. And before awakening, there is understanding. So in the various scriptures, there is a hint that says, don't mistake understanding for awakening, and don't mistake awakening for liberation. The understanding is where you get it intellectually, and there are a lot of, there's actually, there's a lot of scholars of non-duality who have read a lot of things and can tell you, recite all sorts of things and get into debates and know on what page and what verse this is said and that is said. Those people may not even have reached the point of understanding, the first understanding. The first understanding is where you get it intellectually as in relation, for example, to something very specific, like the end of suffering. Oh, this is about the end of suffering. Whereas the pundits, the scholars, might still just be acquiring knowledge and thinking it's about knowledge, acquiring knowledge. So the understanding where you understand the concept intellectually, that understanding is a more innocent understanding. It isn't about, I'm so good because I have all this knowledge. So that sort of book understanding isn't even at the point of, don't mistake understanding for awakening. So the understanding, I would say, is when there is an earnestness that says, oh, I understood what you said intellectually. And I'm not interested in turning it into, look how much I understand, but I'm hoping that it will now deepen. Then you can say, oh, so you have understanding, that's great. You have the understanding on an intellectual level. That starts deepening, and then there is an awakening to certain aspects of the self that require the understanding to weaken the systems enough. And then there's an awakening to oneself, which is very good. And then the combination of the deepening understanding and your own experience of these aspects of yourself, where when you ground into them, you find that there is less interest in the stories about the person than when you're not grounded in them. And eventually the suffering dynamic gets wasted, gets expended, finished. And that is the end of your vasanas and samskaras, let's say. That even after awakening, the vasanas and samskaras are still there, your old tendencies and habits, and they will continue to play themselves out. And as they play themselves out, that energy is used up more and more. So maybe tomorrow we can look at an exercise that is more about dropping into being, the being aspect of self, which in a way can be linked to the witnessing. It is about stopping and just being, but there's a different quality, maybe more grounded in the body rather than in the witnessing. And it might be that the two you don't practice the two simultaneously. It might be that one feels much more authentic to you, and it starts, the stop happens, and one of the two movements happens for a period of time. And then afterwards, the other one might seem more appropriate. So we can talk about this being. And then there are two other aspects that are also very important. And so that is the allowing these energies, this suffering, to arise in a way where it really gets felt, which is very different to the witnessing. In the witnessing, most things will sort of dissolve, and we might think that the witnessing is the answer because everything just dissolves. It dissolves in that present moment, and we can't expect the witnessing to be there all the time. What we want is for the energy at the bottom of that is in the system to come out, which is a different movement to this witnessing and dropping into being. It's about feeling. It's about allowing the repressed energies from our childhood even, and all of the events that have happened between then and now, and maybe even because the mystery of life is that there are often emotions linked to events that don't even relate to this particular incarnation. So what might be referred to as past life embedded energies. They need to start coming out. And when they come out, what is included in them is the doership and attachment to outcomes. So they come out with all the shame. They are the shame, the blame, the pride, the expectation, the worry, the anxiety. And as they're coming out, the energies are leaving the body, which means the deeply ingrained belief of doership is getting less and less. And the last adjunct that we can talk about tomorrow or in other days is learning how to live life from a place of feeling what to do next, which means dropping out of this immense list of shoulds and shouldn'ts that we have, which is based on our attachment to outcomes. So all of these things can happen simultaneously. If we find a stopping of an interest in doing things because we should, because we realize that if each time I do something because I should, that's reinforcing my attachment to outcome. It's reinforcing my attempt to control life turning out a certain way. And so there needs at some point for us to, for a shedding of living in each moment from shoulds and shouldn'ts to a more authentic, what I'd call authentic, allowing life to flow through us without an agenda of how it looks. And that can be very important as part of the release process as well, because there won't be this should or shouldn't about how we how we act, and then the energies can flow more freely. So I have had some requests about the retreats that I hold a 3-week retreat in Australia. And so what I've just described as the different, so what we spoke about in the beginning of which is the conceptual framework, and what most of the satsangs are about. That's one part that gets covered in the retreat. These exercises, which are very useful at getting us to ground into our beingness, is also something that is heavily emphasized, so that over the course of the 3 weeks, where we have 2 satsangs a day for 21 days, there is a movement that is undoing the doership and attachment to outcomes on all of these levels. And then there is the space over this time to talk about the energy releases, and it's held at my house in Australia, in the forest, in nature, so lots of space to go for walks in nature, which to me is something I highly recommend to anyone. Take solo, on your own, leisurely walks in parks and gardens. Make that, if it feels right, part of what you find yourself doing regularly, because it creates a space where contemplation can happen, contemplation about the framework. It creates a space where you can be walking and exploring, allowing the experience to arise. It is something that allows you to be able to drop into being while walking. You're walking in nature, which, so that's why I say in parks and gardens if you can, or in quiet streets where there are nice gardens. It allows you to look and remain interested, start looking at things that maybe you've not really been interested in looking at. I used to walk around a park near my house, and I started to see the difference between different bird species that look very similar. As you look closely, you realize, oh, that's a coot, and that's the dusky moorhen, because they had signs that talk about the different birds, pictures of them. And then you look at it and you go, oh, the coot has a white crest, same shape bird, more or less the same color, but one has a white crest, the other one has a red crest, and then you start seeing, oh, that the other one, the dusky moorhen, has a sort of blue tinge on its wing, and it's a little bit bigger. You start seeing these differences, and this means your attention is coming into the present moment, and you're seeing variance, which means you're not off thinking about what I didn't do properly in the past. Because if you're thinking about that, you're walking past the coots and the dusky moorhens, and you don't even know they're there. So for me, if someone says, what was one of your practices? It wasn't really a practice, I just was doing what I felt like. I enjoyed walking slowly, so it's not really, I wasn't power walking to get my heartbeat up and all of that. Walking slowly, leisurely, on my own. If you go out with a friend, you'll end up talking to your friend all the time, which is another nice activity. It's not so useful in what I'm suggesting. So anyone considering doing a retreat sometime, not necessarily in April when the next one comes up, but the reason I put the 3-week retreat in is that I had a sense that there are people listening to the framework, and each satsang tends to be, in a way, isolated. Whereas if you can string something together, where all of these components that we're talking about become introduced as part of a whole package, let's say, then our intellect starts to see how each of these different layers works in with the other, and hopefully you get to take that away and it continues to function. That's the beauty of the framework, I think, is that it's something that continues to function and continues to reveal more and more of the intricacy of the deeply ingrained attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome. So over the next few days, I think we'll look at the dropping into being, exercise, talk about the emotional releases and the validity of that, whereby it isn't getting involved in what's happening, whereas someone might say it's the opposite of witnessing, it's getting involved, and it's not really, it's allowing things to move through, and there will be a witnessing of those energies moving through. And very importantly, how do I live my life? If life is completely predetermined, how do I live my life? And the answer, in a general sense, is in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do. Now, when it's described as that, what you think or feel, it means it's not telling anyone how to live, really. That is a description of how everyone in life is always living. Everyone in life is always doing what they think or feel to do. And in the what I think, it includes the shoulds and shouldn'ts. So for those people living from shoulds and shouldn'ts, they are just following what they think they should be doing. That is destiny unfolding. That is God's will. When someone is living from the shoulds and shouldn'ts, they're not living out of God's will. It's God's will. However, it's God's will in a way that is likely to perpetuate the deeply ingrained belief in doership and attachment to outcome. So I found that the uncomfortableness was heavily related to living life based on shoulds and shouldn'ts. So I said, that's it. I'm not going to do that as much as is possible. It became something that became important to me. And you don't get rid of it overnight. But you can start playing with little areas. So I found I often would say yes to things that I didn't really feel like doing because I thought I should do them, or because I was afraid of the consequence of saying no. And so I thought, no, change that. Be more honest, be more authentic to what you feel like doing. And at first, after you think that, someone says, let's go out for dinner or something, and you say, you can't say no, and so you say yes, okay, and then you actually, let's not just yet, because I'm not sure how I'm feeling about that. Let me get back to you. And it can feel very, awkward. But actually, after you've done it a few times, it's liberating. It's like, I just need to do what I feel. And so I found that God's instruction to us is coming in each moment, either in the thought of what we should do, or in the form of a feeling of what we feel like doing. They're both God's instruction to us. And I just found that if I follow God's instruction based on what I feel like, it leads to a comfortableness with what I'm doing, with how life felt. And if I followed what I should do, then I'd find at the time, so I said yes to something, and then at the time it's like, I don't want to do this. And there wasn't a comfortableness. So I just found myself shifting. It made sense. I can follow God's instruction. From one place I have an uncomfortableness, and from the other place I have a comfortableness. So the transition didn't happen overnight, but it was an easy transition because I saw each time there was a movement on this, there was more freedom. Doing what I feel like, and that's when the flow with life kicks in, because then what I'm doing is based on not what I should do, but what was more authentic than the shoulds, which are really attached to getting the best outcome, because I believe the best outcome will mean I'm going to be loved more. And ultimately I have this ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in love from the other. So I think for now we can leave it at that, and I hope to see some of you over the next days.